Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila again with another story for you. And I think, as you can see behind me, that you can guess that our story is about a sea captain. And the sea captain's name was Richard Girdler. And he lived around, more than 100 years ago in the early 1800s. Matter of fact, the trip that we're going to learn about today happened in 1826. Now, this picture of the sea captain was a picture that my father had, and I always liked that sea captain, but I like the ocean. And so I thought, well, I'd bring him in here so that you could see him and you could think about Richard Girdler, the sea captain. Well, he lived in Massachusetts, and he was a God-fearing man. He loved Jesus very, very much. And so he did something that few sea captains did in those days. He made sure that his ship was run like Jesus would have wanted it to be. He had worships in the morning. The men that lived and worked on the vessel with him, they all had prayer together. And unlike other ships where the sailors fought and they cussed, and it wasn't a pleasant place to be, Captain Richard's ship was a good place to be. Captains, they sail for months and months on end. And so when he would get home, he wanted to spend a little time with his family. So he had gotten home in April, and the owner of the ship called the Farnsworth had come to him and said, "Richard, would you be willing to take my ship out again? I would like it to leave in October." Well, that sounded like a reasonable thing. And he said to the owner, "But I only have one thing that I would like to do before I say for sure. And that's, I would like to go on board the Farnsworth, and I would like to make sure everything is ready to go." And the owner said, "That's fine with me. Let me know if there's something that we need to do before you can go." He went on board the ship. And his ship might have been like one of these, something like this. And he went He went and he looked at all the sails. He looked at all the rigging to make sure it was all tight in place. He went down inside the main part of the ship to look to see if everything down there, everything that was loaded, was ready to go and it was tight and tied down, because ships roll on the ocean and everything could fly about, and he didn't want that. Well, then he came up and he looked and he saw right here. Oh, I don't know. Maybe you can see it. There was a big anchor in the bow of the ship, and there was another great big anchor at the back of the ship. Those were in good repair, and everything seemed fine with them. But then when he got looking around, he was missing two things. One of them was a little anchor called a kedge, or keege, depending on how you pronounce it. And it was small. And you see how this big anchor, on how the points come out. Well, that anchor probably was this big. But the little anchor that he couldn't find was very small, and these edges were very, very sharp. He noticed that there was something else missing. There was generally a very big rope. You know, the ropes you play jump rope and stuff with, they're about as big around as my finger. But this rope was really big around, and it was called a hawser. And it was very, very, very long. Might of fact, he needed a rope that was 720 feet long. Well, you know, I'm not 6 feet tall, but if, say, I was 6 feet, if you were to lay me down foot to head and you put 120 grandma Sheillas out in a row, that's how long that rope would have been. Well, he needed that little anchor and he needed that big long rope. So he went back to the owner and he said, "Oh, the sails look good. Everything's tied down well. All the equipment seems to be there. But two things. I need the cage, and I need that big hawser, that big long rope." And the owner said, "Well, I understand. Of course you need those. Why don't you go back to your town," which was called Marblehead. What a name. There in Massachusetts along the coast. "Why don't you go back there and buy one and buy the rope?" So the captain said, "That's fine, I'll go get it." So he went back to the town that he lived in. Well, it wasn't hard at all to find the little anchor. That town was right on the ocean, and there was lots of boats, and so the anchor was easy to find. But when he went to get the rope, he went to the man that made ropes. You know, they took a lot of small pieces of like jute and they twisted them together to make these big, big long ropes. But by now, it was October. And October, it rains and it rains and it rains over by the ocean. And there was no place to make a rope that long. There was no building long enough to do it in. And there was no sidewalk or piece of cement or a boardwalk that was long enough to lay it out. And even if you could, you'd have to make it in the rain. Ooh, well, the man that made the rope said, I don't know what I can do. I can't make anything as long as that." Well, finally, Captain Richard said, "You know, what if we made it in two pieces? Could you do that? And then you could just hook the ends together. You could intertwine them." And he said, "Yes, I can do that." So it wasn't long till he had those two long ropes made, and he'd intertwined them and hooked them together so they were so strong that no matter what pulled on them, they wouldn't come apart. Well, now he had what he needed. So he went right down. And, you know, a lot of the men that were part of this crew were the same crew from the sail that he had gone on before. So they were used to the fact that Captain Richard believed in God. And they were used to having worship and praying. And the majority of them became believers in God. The boat was supposed to sail out of the harbor in Boston, Massachusetts, and it did. Everything was going well. You know, Captain Richard, he was an excellent captain. You know, when you get out in the middle of the ocean, there's nothing but water all the way around you. You can't see anything else. And you can't tell whether that's north or this is north or that's north. In the daytime, he could tell where the sun came up, which was in the east, and where it went down in the west. And at night, he could see all those shining stars up above, and he knew exactly where he was. And he had a little thing called a barometer, so he could tell if there were storms coming. He was a good captain. Well, it wasn't too long till they had sailed. I wanted to show you on the world. They went. Here was the United States way up here, and over here was Massachusetts. They sailed all the way around, all the way over here. Here is Africa. Well, up here between Spain and Africa, there is a waterway called the Mediterranean Sea runs through there. And they were going to the Bay of Gibraltar. Gibraltar. I can't say it. Well, everybody knows that there's a big rock that divides that little waterway. The rock is on one side, the rock of Gibraltar. There, I can say it. And they were going to go directly into that waterway because he had, looking at his barometer and things, he thought that there was a storm coming. Besides, he needed to go that way anyway. Well, he was not the only one thinking that. I have just a few little pictures to show you. Look at this. There is that mountain. This is a drawing, so it's not a picture. But look at all those boats going into the bay. Well, the story says that there were 300 boats that all ended up parking or anchoring. They didn't park inside of that bay. And they thought this was a good place to be protected from the storm that was coming. So Captain Richard and all the other captains, they got really busy and they let down all their anchors and they made sure they hooked tight underneath the water. And not only did they hook the anchor on the bow of the boat, they also hooked the big anchor that was on the back of the boat. And you know that little tiny anchor that he bought? Generally, what they used that for was to keep the boat kind of in one place. When you have your dog on a leash or a rope, if the leash is hooked to something, your dog can go around in a circle. Well, this little anchor, they would hook kind of in the middle of the boat because if when the storm came up, if the tides were rolling in like this, but the wind was coming from the other way, then the boat would go, it would be hit by the tides and it would go this way. Then the wind would blow it this way and this way and this way. So he got out that little anchor and he got out that great big rope. And even though it was a little anchor, he wanted it to be really long and really secure. So he hooked all that and they put the sails to the proper place so that the ships wouldn't beat about as much. He knew what he was doing. And I'm sure he asked God to help them. Well, they didn't have very long to wait. That storm started to come up when it was night. Look at those black, black clouds. And our captain knew it wasn't going to be long till a gale started. Can you see the ship there in the darkness? But what's over here? Rocks. What happens if a ship runs into the rocks? It's not good. Well, by midnight, the gale that he thought was going to happen came up, and the wind was blowing at hurricane force. They couldn't hardly hear for the wind, and the boat was going back and forth and back and forth. Look at it on those waves. It's almost laying on its side. And the captain hollered over that of the wind. Come, men, come kneel down. Let's talk to the God that calmed the sea when he was here on earth. Come. And they all came, and they knelt down right there on the deck of the ship with the water and the waves going over top of them. They were drenched. Those waves went. And the captain, he looked around. Remember the picture I showed you of all those ships coming in to that bay? Well, as he looked around, the problem was, yes, it was kind of protected, but because it had an inlet from the ocean, the wind and the waves were coming up that inlet, and it was hitting those boats. Now, what do you suppose happens? Now, pretend that we have a big bowl, and in that bowl is 300 ships all being beat about by the waves. What if the wind blows them both the same way and they crash into each other? But 300 in that little bay, they were going all over the place and they were hitting together, and some of them were crashing against the rocks, and there was no saving them. They were just in pieces. Others lost their anchors and they tipped over in the water. It was not a good thing. The captain, he could feel on the rope that the one anchor had broken loose. There was too much pressure on it. And that end of the boat started going like this in the wind and the waves, and it started twisting. But they still had the big anchor, and the captain. This is a captain's wheel. That's how he steered the boat. He tried his best. And pretty soon, one of the men on the deck called, "The big anchor's let loose." And it was being dragged in the water. They didn't know what to do. They got down and they prayed again. Oh, God, help us, just like you helped the disciples. Please help us. They were afraid because all around them they could see parts of ships. They could see men down in the water trying to keep above the water so they could breathe. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. It was a long night. Well, when morning came, even though They had been heading right toward the rocks. Somehow, their ship never got there. It just kind of went like this, like this, like this, in the middle of the bay. Well, the storm stopped. The sun came out, and the captain and all the men looked around. There were broken boats everywhere. There were boats that had hit each other and they had crunched open, and all their boxes and everything had floated out. They found that there were only 50 of those 300 ships that were still totally in one piece after the storm, and 400 men had drowned. It was a terrible storm. But what kept them? They were heading toward the rocks. They had lost both of their big anchors. What had kept them? Well, the captain sent out some of his men in their little lifeboat from the side of their ship, and they put it down in the water, and they started following what was left of the ropes of the anchors that went to the anchors. Well, they found the big anchor didn't come loose. It had come loose from the bottom, but it had been just drug along by the boat. It hadn't stuck tight like it's supposed to. So they were able to pull that up out of the water because they would need it back in their ship. They found the smaller anchor. Now, it had broken off the ship, but it still had a rope floating on it, and they were able to pull it up. And I don't know if they had names on their anchors, but they knew that those were their anchors. Then they started looking for that little bitty catch. They found that big, big rope, and it was still tied to the ring in the middle of the ship. They must have jumped out of either they jumped in the water, they had to have, because when they pulled and pulled and pulled and pulled on that big, huge rope, that hawser rope, it wouldn't come. No matter how hard they pulled, he wouldn't come. Well, some of the men that were good swimmers jumped down into the water, and they went to the bottom of the bay. And do you know what they found? They found that little bitty tiny anchor. And do you know what it was doing? Remember, I told you the sides of it? Just like this anchor. Of course, this is a little boat, but it looks something like this, but it was little. And these edges on it were very tiny. And they were very sharp. And they weren't very thick. Well, what they found was that little tiny anchor. It had come loose when they thought it had, but it had scooted along on the bottom of the bay floor, and it caught on something. There was a metal ring, and it went right in there, and it caught. And they unhooked it. And when they got up on the boat, they went, Captain Richard, you won't believe it. The, the catch, that little anchor, it was caught. It was caught on a big round ring on an old Spanish ship's anchor. that must have weighed 4,000 pounds. None of the rest of the anchors would have fit in that ring. And only God could have made sure that when that anchor was being dragged by the ship, that it went right over that ring and went exactly in the hole and hooked so the boat couldn't go any further toward the rocks. Now tell me, who is in charge of everything? I think that God guided that anchor to go into that round circle, and God knew it had to be hooked to something really, really heavy, like that 4,000-pound anchorage thing. Can you trust God? What if the captain had never asked God to help? Remember to talk to him every day, boys and girls. I want to remind you and your mummies and daddies that every Friday at 8 a.m., there's a new story for you. So it'll be available for you from Friday on. And of course, you're always welcome to go back and look at the other stories again. But every week, there'll be a new story. Tell your friends. This is Grandma Sheilla saying bye for now. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.